ever journaled about a decision you already knew you needed to make? I'm sure you have. We've all used journals to reflect, to think better, to express ourselves. Sometimes we listen to podcasts, right, to get a better understanding about certain things. Or we find ourselves trying to just regulate ourselves, our nervous systems, especially after saying that we're going to do a thing and we don't do it. And so what I realize is that this little thing, it can actually support me in having the conversation, the most difficult conversation, or support me in making a decision, or this can actually become what I do instead of having the conversation, instead of making the decision, right? Same journal, just each have a very different purpose. And so I really want to talk about how to tell the difference. All right. Again, same journal, very different purpose. And I know it's been a while since I've been live here. During that time, I really kept coming back to one question, which is what happens when we really understand ourselves, when we often have the tools and still don't do the things that we know we need to do, the things that we know that would literally transform our lives. And the space between knowing and doing is what I want us to explore more deeply these days. I've also been building a community, so that has taken up a lot of my time and developing the curriculum for that. And it's been a journey nonetheless. And I now have some time to come up for air a little bit. But I know that a lot of us can relate to the idea of knowing what we need to do and not doing it. And really trying to find what is the block, what is the resistance that is keeping us from doing the thing. And, when I think back, when I think of the journal, because this conversation actually came up with a client of mine during our coaching call, where she says that, I've been doing all of the things, like I do all of my morning routines, and they're no longer helping, right? She's like, I'm not feeling any better. My anxiety is still through the roof. Like, I'm not feeling better. And I'll get to what I told her to do in the end, but I know that feeling. I know that feeling where I'm like sitting with my journal open. I've already written several pages about the same thing, whether it's the decision I'm thinking about or the situation that happened. And I know what I think. I know what I feel. I even know maybe what I'm afraid will happen, or I might even know what needs to happen. And I'm still writing another page, right? One part of me says, I'm processing, right? This is the opportunity for me to process. And another part of me says, nah, Fran, you're buying more time. There's a delay in your reflection, right? And that's really when I saw it. That journal wasn't giving me any new information, anything that I didn't already know, right? It was giving me something to do instead of making the decision, or instead of having the conversation I needed to have, or doing the thing that I was really terrified to do. And the reason that I'm telling you this is because avoidance doesn't always look careless or reckless. Sometimes it doesn't even look obvious. Sometimes it looks pretty thoughtful or disciplined and even emotionally aware. We often don't think that journaling and reflecting all of the time is necessarily something that's, and I don't like using the good or bad thing words, but we don't necessarily think that, like, oh, we think like this is a good thing to do, right? And we realize that, well, maybe we don't realize, but one of the things that, well, I'll get back to that. I don't want to say what I told my client to do, but the way to tell the difference whether or not this self-care routine is actually supporting me or actually helping me to delay my, you know, progress, quote unquote. Also don't like using that word because it just feels very matrixy. But self-care that supports you says, listen, I use the practice. And because I use the practice, I have more capacity to do the thing that I've just sort of been overthinking about or processing. Then I address what actually needs my attention, right? But self care that becomes avoidance says, I use the practice. And because of the practice, I find a bit of temporary relief. I feel good for the moment, right? But then what happens eventually is that I return to the same situation without doing anything differently. And so that's how you know the difference, whether you're doing self care that supports you or self care that's really avoidance underneath it all. Because the practice isn't what tells you which one it is. It's what you do afterwards, right? After you have all the self reflection, after you make all the connections and connect the dots, after you really articulate your thoughts and you process, right? And so one says, I address the feeling. The other says, I feel better, but nothing changes. And then the other one says, I've deepened the situation. So sometimes when we reflect so much that we've opened up another spiral, another rabbit hole to climb into, right? And so here's where we have to invite a bit of honesty. Feeling better isn't always evidence that the practice has been supportive. Sometimes feeling better is sometimes sorry. Sometimes feeling better is the reward that keeps the avoidance going. All right. So, for example, you listen to the podcast. Maybe it's a podcast about boundaries because you feel like you need to, implement more boundaries in your life, and you feel very validated, and you feel like you understood. But the conversation with the person that you need to have the boundaries with actually doesn't happen, right? So then you create a new routine around this boundary and you feel productive, but the decision remains untouched. Like you just never make the decision. And then you journal, right? Until the emotion doesn't feel as intense, but you never have the conversation, right? So the relief is not necessarily a bad thing. We want to feel the relief because then that gives us the capacity to do the next thing, right? The trouble here is getting caught up with just having the relief only, right? Because relief and change are not the same thing. All right. So remember that. So if we were going to take this through, and I'm sweating because it's hot in here. So if we were to take this through, so there's this method, and maybe I'll explain this method maybe a little bit later, some other time. But first, we want to recognize, right? What practice do I reach for when a particular action feels uncomfortable? What do I typically do, right? But before I reach it, what feeling am I anticipating? And what feeling can I, what feeling do I want to find relief in? Right. And then do I need support now or am I trying to escape the discomfort attached to the action? And then what is one concrete thing that I can do after the practice? And so for instance, you journal for 10 minutes, then you send the email. I'm really big on giving yourself a timer, a time limit on a lot of things, mainly because for most of us who tend to spiral, we need to create a bit of structure around the spiral. Okay. So you write in the journal for 10 minutes and then you take a walk. After you journal about the situation, you do the thing, that you said you're going to do in the journal that you know you need to do. Send the email, have the conversation, then you maybe go for a walk, then maybe you make the decision, then you breathe, and then you begin the conversation, right? So the tool stays. We like the tools, but the tools can also become a trap. So we have to be able to allow ourselves to weave in and out of the tools, right? Sometimes the sequence may change, but the tools can stay. Okay, so whether you're taking a walk and that helps you, and then you make the decision, again, whether you breathe and then you make the decision, use the tools. But as you can see with each tool, there's an action connected to it. So one of the things I told my client was, first of all, I gave her, I told her, don't do any more reflection. Stop reflecting. I told her, don't pick up the journal for a whole week. And actually, it's funny because I told this to my therapy client as well, but I, and it was difficult for this particular client to not pick up the journal, to actually just sit with the thoughts and to allow them to kind of do the dance without immediately reaching for the relief, right? If you find yourself using something repeatedly and maybe almost feeling a bit dependent on it, then sometimes less is more, right? So giving yourself a break, switching up the tools, and then connecting each tool with an action will allow you to kind of begin to see the changes that you want to make in your life, right? So let's see. I'm looking at my notes here. All right. So if we were to talk about a few more examples, so sometimes some of us have a hard time with rest. So rest can maybe help with some of the decisions that need to be made or some of the hard conversations that need to be had. The distinction is, does the rest restore my capacity? Or does it repeatedly replace an action? Okay. So always decide what you will do when you decide to use the tool. If I'm going to journal, I'm going to take an action. If I'm going to rest, I'm going to take an action after the rest. Okay. And that gives you the habit of execution, of doing the thing. Okay. And so understand that this thing here, let me pull it out. Never the problem, never the enemy. I don't like to use the word problem anyway. But the podcast was never the issue. The routine isn't the issue, but any of them can become somewhere to go when we don't want to face what comes next. Okay. And so the practice isn't what tells you whether it's self care or self avoidance. It's what you do afterwards that does. Okay. So, what is one thing you already know needs your attention? And then go and do that thing. All right. Do the thing. And if you've been trying to understand why knowing hasn't translated into doing, that's what we explore here. Subscribe and just, join me in the next conversation. Since I'm back, y'all. I'm back. And there's a quiz underneath the video that if you're trying to figure out what your resistance style is, if you tend to resist doing certain things and it just takes you a little while to kind of get going, the quiz can tell you what that style is and give you something that you can do immediately to disrupt that pattern. So that's all I got. Thank you for watching and thank you for being here with me. And if you're catching the replay, let me know. But I'll try to do these at least once a month. At least once a month, do a live. But until then, I shall see you next time, and I'll see you on the other side of change.